My name is Kathleen, with a K, Lizea. I was born in Whiteville, North Carolina, on September the 11th, 1918.
Our story begins in the tumultuous year of 1918, the year of Kathleen's birth. The President of the United States was Woodrow Wilson, who was by now halfway through his second term in office. A year earlier, in April of 1917, the United States had declared war on Germany, thus entering the First World War. By the beginning of 1918, over 4 million Americans had been mobilized for the war effort, and by the summer of 1918, about 2 million U.S. soldiers had arrived in France. Arriving at the rate of 10,000 soldiers per day, America's entry into the war finally began to wear down the German war machine. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, over 110,000 American soldiers had died. 45,000 of those casualties were killed by disease, not combat. As calamitous as the conflict was, an even more dangerous foe was responsible for a far higher number of casualties across the globe. In a matter of months, the Spanish flu spread like wildfire throughout the planet, eventually claiming over 50 million lives. It was against this backdrop that James Charlton, or Jamie Lazaire, and his wife, Mary Alice Jordan Lazaire, would welcome into this world their second child, Kathleen, on September 11, 1918. At the dawn of the new decade, the Roaring '20s, the Lazaire family was still living in the town of Whiteville, the seat of Columbus County in eastern North Carolina.
I remember we used to go from Whiteville to Allendale in that car. It was a Model T Ford. In the wintertime, it would be so cold that we'd heat brick in the fireplace and then wrap them up and put them in the floorboard of the car to keep us kind of warm as we went to Allendale like at Christmas. And I remember one time my daddy borrowed a car that Model T was an open car, and he borrowed a car that had some glassed-in windows so it wouldn't be so cold.
In the 1920 census, we learned that Kathleen's 30-year-old father is working as a farm demonstration agent. The Lazaire family would continue living in Whiteville for another 6 years, during which time 3 more Lazaire children would be born. Then, in 1926, the family would move to Florence, South Carolina, where Jamie had been offered a job as district agent for the Clemson Extension Service.
I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers. The first one, the oldest sister, was Mary Alice Lazaire, and then I was next. Then the next one was Dorothy, and then James, who was James Tarleton Jr., and then Ethel Murray, and then Julian Hampton.
The 1930 census shows that the Lazaire family was living in the city of Florence, that all 6 of their children had been born, and that Jamie was working in his new job with the Clemson Extension Service. 2 years later, they would leave their home in the city and move to Second Loop Road, which at that time was well outside the city limits.
James fell out of a tree. He was climbing a tree and fell out, and Daddy said, "It's time to take these boys to the country, give them something to do." That's when he started looking for a farm. We moved out the week after Christmas. Cold, cold, cold. That big old house. It had no heat, no water, no electricity, no nothing. And we moved into that big old cold house. when Dorothy and Alan, when they'd come home from school, they had to fix the lamps. See, we didn't have electricity, we had oil lamps, and those oil lamps had to be filled, and the wicks had to be trimmed and all to get them ready for the night. But they didn't have electric irons, so they had to have, even in the summer, we had to have a big roaring fire to heat those flat irons to iron. So, of course, they had to do some of that too, and of course the place had to be swept and dusted and all that, and bring in the wood to cook with. Mom had been cooking on a gas stove in Florence. She went out there and she had to cook on a wood stove. I mean, it was like going back 100 years. It really was. Just the way people lived on the farm back in those days.
Kathleen graduated from Florence High School in 1935, and on graduation day she was justifiably proud to wear the beautiful dress she had made herself in her home economics class for the grand occasion. At the time of the 1940 census, James and Mary Lazare, aged 50 and 47, along with all 6 of their children, are living on the Second Loop Road in Florence. James continued working as a district agent for Clemson's Extension Service. Both Kathleen and Dorothy are working 40-hour work weeks as clerks, Dorothy for an insurance company and Kathleen for the Soil Conservation District office. However, we can see that Kathleen was winning the salary battle with her siblings, having toiled the entire year of 1939 for an annual salary of $980.
We had an air base here in Florence when we were young girls. Dorothy and I, we had a good, because both of us worked uptown. So after we'd work, we'd go to the USO. And that's where we'd meet those boys at the USO. Of course, I had dated Howard before, but he'd already gone off to war himself.
Howard had enlisted shortly after Pearl Harbor, and upon completion of Army Officer Candidate School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, newly minted Second Lieutenant Frederick Howard DeBerry was granted a short leave of absence to return home. On December 20th, 1942, with only days remaining before he reported for duty at Fort Benning, Howard and Kathleen exchanged their wedding vows at Florence's Central Methodist Church. Due to wartime gas rationing, only a small number of family and friends were present for their wedding, and there are no surviving photographs of the ceremony and festivities of that day. The newlyweds then traveled to Fort Benning, Georgia, where they spent the next 9 months adjusting to military life as a married couple. It's September of 1943, when Howard's units left for maneuvers in Louisiana. Kathleen, by then pregnant with her first child, returned to Florence to live with the family. It was there, on February 10, 1944, that Frederick Howard DeBerry Jr., or Rick, was born. Due to the demands of his wartime service, Howard would not be able to meet his infant son for another 6 weeks. Meanwhile, back in Florence, during his first routine baby checkup, the doctor discovered a problem with Rick's heart and recommended a thorough cardiology workup at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Howard, now stationed at Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia, was again granted leave to join his wife and son in Baltimore, where he and Kathleen learned that Rick had been diagnosed with an enlarged heart. A year later, his eyesight began to decline, and after a series of further medical evaluations, doctors warned that by the time he was 13, Rick would be blind, a prediction that would prove to be tragically accurate. What no one knew at that early stage was that Rick would also be deaf in his teens, suffer from seizures, and endure severe scoliosis of his spine. With the end of World War II, First Lieutenant Howard DeBerry was discharged in November 1945 and was finally able to return home to Florence to Kathleen and son Rick, now 21 months old. There, Howard was able to resume working as head of the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, the same office where he had met and fallen in love with Kathleen years earlier. After almost 3 years of separation, the DeBerry family enjoyed their time together and continued to grow and prosper. Their second child, Kathleen Lazare, was born on December 28, 1946. Then they welcomed another daughter into the family, Jacqueline Elizabeth, on April 2, 1951. A third daughter, Maria Cannon, would arrive on April 4, 1954.
He went to kindergarten in Florence and got along pretty good. And then when time for him to go to school, they have a school for the deaf and blind up near Spartanburg. So we enrolled him in that school. And he went to school there for 3 years. And he had so many allergies that he stayed in the infirmary more than he stayed in the classroom. So that's when we went to Florida. It was the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, and the school was right there on the ocean. So we figured that that would be a good place where he could go to school, and they agreed to let him come as a day student.
And so it was. After 12 years of marriage and 9 years with everyone under the same roof, the DeBerry family would again live apart from each other. This time, rather than war, the family would now be separated by love, by the unshakable desire to provide the best possible care for their son and brother. In 1956, Howard began developing Tarleton Estates, a residential community located off Florence's Second Loop Road. When his family returned from Florida a year later, Howard and Kathleen once again joined forces, with Kathleen serving as Howard's secretary. She relished being back in a business environment, and working as a team, the F. Howard DeBerry Real Estate Company continued to thrive. By the early 1960s, Howard had purchased several properties along Second Loop Road and was part owner of a cemetery, Florence Memorial Gardens. With Tarleton Estates almost fully developed, he and Kathleen began developing Tarleton Estates West. As is the case with any large real estate development project, Howard had to take on significant debt to finance the construction of streets, sewage, and utilities. As difficult and time-consuming as running such an enterprise was, the DeBerry family would soon face a much more monumental challenge. In the early hours of March 4, 1965, a massive heart attack ended Howard's life at the age of 51. Although the family was still reeling from the shock of its recent loss, Kathleen immediately rolled up her sleeves and took over as head of the company. In order to sell real estate in her own right, she also studied for and passed the real estate examination, thus becoming the first woman to be licensed as a realtor in Florence. Always overflowing with energy and determination, she completed the new development and continued to sell lots and houses, which allowed her to whittle away at the company's debt burden. As the years passed, Kathleen maintained a hectic lifestyle, shepherding the family business and serving in local clubs and organizations, while at the same time continuing to raise her children as a widow. At many points, it must have seemed almost impossible to keep up the pace and to make ends meet. Kathleen and family were truly blessed to have a treasured helper. Her name was Alzetta Edie. Zetta had started working for the DeBerrys in 1951, and when Kathleen and the children returned to Florence in the summer of 1957, Zetta began working and living in the DeBerry home on a full-time basis. Given Miss Caddy's always-on-the-go lifestyle, everyone saw Zetta as a crucial member of the family. Recognizing her vital contributions, Kathleen often referred to Zetta as an angel sent by God. In the summer of 1965, Kathleen's parents hosted a party to celebrate their 50th anniversary. One of the guests that day was a family friend and former county agent who had worked for Kathleen's father many years earlier. Not one to beat around the bush, this guest approached Kathleen and told her that he wanted to get better acquainted by going out on a date. Kathleen let him know that she was not yet ready to consider such a proposal. Not deterred by Kathleen's suggestion that he wait before asking her out again on a date, it would appear that his delayed persistence paid off, as on February 4th, 1967, Kathleen's brother Julian presided over Kathleen's marriage to Edward Briggs Baskin Sr. in the chapel of Highland Park Methodist Church. When the newlyweds took stock of their dual households and families, and keeping in mind Kathleen's status as a successful businesswoman and civic leader, as well as Ed's successful dairy and farm operation, The couple agreed that it would be best if Jacqueline and Maria finished high school in Florence, allowing them to keep their childhood friends, music involvements, and church activities. For this reason, for the first 5 years together, they maintained homes in Florence and Bishopville, commuting back and forth as often as possible. Then, in the summer of 1972, with the girls headed off to college and starting off on their own careers, Kathleen sold the family home in Florence and moved to Bishopville. Based on her father's long association with agriculture, Kathleen quickly fell in love with the daily activity of farm life. She made new friends in town, as well as among the extended Baskin family, and was active in the Bethlehem Methodist Church and various other civic organizations. Now that all their children had married and started to have their own children, Kathleen's family continued to grow and grow. In fact, her extended family would continue to increase its numbers to the point where today it spans 4 generations and includes 11 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren. Kathleen would spend another 38 years at the Woodside Farm in Bishopville, where she and Ed would enjoy their lives together, always busy tending to the farm and hosting innumerable family get-togethers. They also managed to satisfy their wanderlust by putting quite a few miles on their Winnie. On December 1st, 2001, Kathleen went on a Christmas shopping trip with her special friends, the Van Girls. While she was gone, Ed left a check for mail at the post office. As always, he took his favorite shortcut, a dirt road that passed through one of his fields. Ed never completed that final errand and died peacefully as his truck and his life slowly rolled to a stop at the side of a dirt road in the middle of a field, part of his beloved Woodside Farm. Kathleen remained at Woodside for 8 more years before moving to the Methodist Manor in Florence at the age of 91. Once there, she immediately began the task of turning a long-held dream into reality.
These special needs people are living longer now than they used to, and a lot of them outlive their parents, or their parents get old and they can't take care of them at home. So I decided that I would like to build a house in this area of Florence County and in memory of Rick. So we want to call it Rick's House. And so I worked it out with Aldersgate Ministry, and they have asked Methodist Manor to give them some land to build a house on.
Never giving in to the naysayers and working tenaciously over the next few years, Kathleen finally realized her dream on April 19, 2015, when Rick's house was dedicated on the grounds of the Methodist Manor. The succeeding years of Kathleen's life have continued to fly by, always enlivened by her seemingly boundless energy and good cheer. Over the years, she continued to serve in various community activities and always stayed lovingly involved with her now truly blended family and her close circle of friends. Through it all, whenever we're around her, we experience her tremendous capacity for love, her always upbeat personality, and her legendary storytelling skills. A century of living life at its fullest provides enough time to amass a great treasure chest of stories, tales that Kathleen unfolded in her inimitable way, and always accompanied with a smile and that trademark twinkle in her eyes.
I didn't imagine that I would live this long.
Our Kathleen has certainly had a long and productive life. She was a successful, even trailblazing businesswoman. She continues to be a caring and loving matriarch to her extended family and remains a lifelong friend to many more. She has touched so many lives and entered so many hearts that coming together to celebrate her century is an altogether fitting thing to do.